Suddenly, the pain became unbearable, but I was doing my best to get through it calmly. I kept looking into my husband's eyes and I kept reassuring him that everything was going to be okay, but I think I was saying that more to myself than to him. While I was pregnant, it seemed like every mother I spoke to would share their birth story with me. I often joke with my husband and tell him it was like these women were trying to scare me out of giving birth. I had no way of knowing that my own birth story would be more terrifying than anything I had been told. I'm a pretty small woman, about 5 foot nothing, and I'm often mistaken for a teen even though I'm in my 20s. While I was pregnant, everyone often joked with me and said I must be carrying twins because my belly was so large. By the time my due date rolled around, I was so tired of being pregnant. The day after, I noticed I was getting a lot of cramping pains, and I thought I might be in labor, so we went to the hospital, but the doctors told me that it was either just a false labor or pre-labor and sent me home. That night, the cramping got even worse, to the point where I was in pain. But I was too afraid to go to the hospital because I didn't want to get sent home again and waste my husband's time driving me to the hospital and back. The next morning, I had an appointment with my OB-GYN. She gave me a quick examination and told me that I was actually 5 centimeters dilated and I needed to get to the hospital right away. At that point, I had been in active labor for over 15 hours. I remember thinking at the time I was so glad I didn't end up giving birth at home. When we got to the hospital, I was admitted straight away, and my parents and in-laws showed up to comfort me and cheer me on soon after. I ended up getting an epidural because I was so exhausted from lack of sleep and my tolerance had withered away to nothing. My husband and I were really nervous. After 10 more hours of labor, I had barely progressed. I was only 7 centimeters dilated, and my daughter's head had not descended into the pelvis yet, and the doctor told me that my labor would not progress until that happened. 3 hours later, he recommended a cesarean section to avoid any complications and to think it over. I was so frightened. The idea of going under the knife terrified me, but I knew I would have to do the right thing in order to make sure my daughter was born safely. An hour later, I made the call to have a cesarean section, and I had to wait another hour to get into the operating room. In the room, I was surrounded by nurses, surgeons, and an anesthesiologist. I was so scared, and I could tell my husband was too, but I did my best to make sure I was calm and hide it as best I could so as not to alarm him. He nearly passed out when they put my epidural in, so I didn't want him passing out in the operating room. Before the surgery started, the doctors pricked me with something sharp to make sure I was numb, but I wasn't numb, and I yelled, "I just felt that! Please don't cut me open!" Again and again, the doctors reassured me that the surgery would not start until I was completely numb. They increased the amount of medication they gave me, and it seemed like they were working, so they began the surgery. As the blade slid down my stomach, I could feel it, but at the same time, I was dazed from the medicine, so it wasn't that painful, and I put it down to more being able to sense it. Suddenly, the pain became unbearable, but I was doing my best to get through it calmly. I kept looking into my husband's eyes, and I kept reassuring him that everything was going to be okay, but I think I was saying that more to myself than to him. They made a second incision to widen the area because my daughter was so large. At that point, I couldn't contain myself anymore. The anesthesiologist tried administering some gas to knock me out, but I squirmed away from the oxygen mask because I did not want to miss my daughter's birth. Even the sensation of doctors moving my daughter around so she could be in the right position to remove her was unbearable. It felt like it went on forever, but they finally got her out. I didn't get to see her because there was a sheet in the way, but I heard her crying loudly. At that point, I managed to breathe a sigh of relief because I knew my daughter was healthy. After she was removed, the doctors needed to remove the amniotic sac and the placenta. This, by far, was the most painful part of the surgery. It felt like I was being stabbed repeatedly. I started screaming again, and I was pleading with them to stop the surgery. I told them I couldn't take the pain anymore. At this point, this is where my memory gets a little hazy. The doctors didn't know it at the time, but I was having a bad reaction to one of the painkillers they gave me. I guess 1 in 1,000 people are allergic to this specific painkiller. I started fading in and out of consciousness. I remember little bits and pieces, like when they were fishing a needle around in my wrist to do a cardio test. I remember them checking my stomach to make sure my uterus was shrinking back into place correctly, whilst I was trying to fight the nurse off that was doing it. Each time I faded out of consciousness, I was convinced I was dying from blood loss or something. I would be laying there as the pain began to fade and everything around me went black, and I would think, this is it. This is where I die. All of the different painkillers they administered to me left me a little loopy, I guess. My husband told me that during this time, I actually got to hold my daughter for the first time, and I don't even remember it. The doctors were worried that my heart was going to stop, so they had what they call a crash kit nearby in case that happened. They needed to x-ray me, so my husband was told to leave with my daughter. I lost consciousness for the final time during these tests and stayed out cold for 9 hours straight. When I came around, a nurse was looking over me and she said, "Good thing you came to just now. We were about to move you to the ICU." At this point, I was still really groggy, but all I could think about was my daughter, and I kept asking her if she was okay. They brought her to me and I got to hold her for the second time, but in my mind, I consider it the first time because it's the first time I remember actually seeing her. I couldn't believe this was my child. She was so large, she looked like a 2-month-old baby. I asked her how big she was, and they informed me that her birth weight was 10 pounds and 7.8 ounces. I was shocked, to say the least. She also had a thick head of dark brown hair, just like mine, and to me, she was the most beautiful thing in the whole world. I think I was crying and sobbing the entire time they were wheeling me away from the operating room to the room I was staying in. After we got discharged from the hospital, I would have recurring nightmares about the surgery and losing consciousness after it. When I would try to talk to people about it, they would just tell me to just be thankful my daughter was born healthy and forget about the fact that her birth was so traumatic to me. This bothered me because I am very grateful that my daughter was born healthy, and I always have been. Those comments also made it harder for me to deal with how I felt a lot of guilt because of it. I've had to learn how to put my foot down with people every time someone makes a comment that minimizes my experience or tries to make me feel guilty for being scarred. I don't think they are doing it on purpose, but I have to tell them how these comments make me feel. I've also had to ask family members to not bring it up so much or tell other people about it because I hate being asked questions about it. I'm still dealing with those events. So much so that I skipped my 6-week checkup after my daughter was born because I was so afraid. This pushed me into seeing a professional about it. Now, the only thing I regret is not asking for help sooner. The nightmares have nearly gone away, but I still have nightmares sometimes when people bring it up or something reminds me of it. I just hope that one day I will be able to put this behind me and enjoy my time with my family like I'm supposed to.